My name is Emilie Bowles. I am an Andragogical Consultant at Riverside School Board. And the title of my thesis is In Survival Mode, Adult Education Teachers' Experience of COVID-19 and Their Use of Digital Technologies. So I was really looking at how COVID-19 impacted teachers in our network, how it impacted their use of digital technologies, and what kinds of disruptions were specific to the adult education network. I'd actually had a completely different research idea that I had to scrap when it became apparent that COVID wasn't going away. So I decided to make lemonade out of lemons and really kind of dive into it. And during COVID, it became quite apparent that, in every press conference, we were talking about how elementary schools and high schools were being impacted, how universities were being impacted, or stage depths were being impacted, and nobody was talking about what was happening to adult learners in the in-between space or to teachers in the in-between space. So I really wanted to kind of shine a bit of light on our sector and what we were experiencing at the time, and share a little bit of what the teachers were going through in our sector, because it was definitely different from some of the other educational environments at the time. Between May and July of 2021 was when I did interviews with the participants. So it's a qualitative research study, specifically using a case study methodology. So really trying to, speak to each teacher and get a sense of what their experience was like in their specific environment, and then to compare across all of those experiences to see what commonalities or what specific challenges were being faced. So I also used a Socratic wheel as part of my research. So in addition to the interviews that I was doing with teachers, I really wanted to kind of visualize what the changes in their ed tech use were from pre-pandemic to during the pandemic. So I had about 10 questions, and I arranged them on this wheel. I asked them to rate on a scale of 1 to 10. For example, how important did you think it was to use technology in your teaching? I had them rate during the first interview, which had like a pre-COVID focus, the before times. We rated their experiences around that wheel, and then we did it again in the during COVID interview. 8 teachers who were generous enough to share some of their really precious time with me during what was a incredibly stressful period, both for their students and also for them. And to hear those kinds of stories, hearing that teachers were just in survival mode, trying so hard to make things work, it was really difficult. It was, but a lot of teachers appreciated that they were finally getting to talk about what happened, and kind of share a little bit of their experience. Some of the main findings from this study, first of all, again and again and again, teachers repeated that one-size-fits-all professional development does not work. So one-size-fits-all training for teachers, it really is a waste of time. Teachers need training that is relevant to their context, but when teachers have really personalized professional development with one-on-one support, or they are exploring resources online, taking a course, reading a book, listening to a podcast, and getting something that's really, fits right into whatever it is they need, it goes so much further. And that was pre-COVID and during COVID. Teachers felt that COVID was kind of a catalyst. They had to change, they had to adapt. One of the most interesting shifts actually had to do with teachers using digital technology to do formative assessment and give feedback. Prior to COVID, it would have been like a whole hoopla to get out the technology and get everybody signed in and be able to give that feedback digitally on a regular basis. So it was easier to keep track of the feedback that they'd given. It wasn't just a sheet of paper handed to a student that then immediately got lost, or, feedback that you would have said verbally that would have been forgotten, 5 minutes later. So being able to have a record of that feedback for the teacher and the student was great. And also, discovering things like automatically graded forms that you can get, the student can get their results in an instant. That was really game-changing for a lot of teachers, and it's just the way that things are going to be moving forward. So the advice that teachers had centered around 3 main themes, and the first one was purpose. So there has to be a purpose to using the technology. Learning is always the goal, and technology is the way that you are going to achieve that goal. But technology isn't your starting point. It's not the focus. It should always be about student learning. The second point was that it's okay to be vulnerable. I think that was something that teachers and students learned, firsthand during the pandemic. There's no way nobody was prepared for this kind of situation. Everybody was learning along the way, so you had to adapt, had to kind of roll with the punches. So as they were kind of, building the plane, as they were flying it, a lot of mistakes were bound to happen. And so it was okay to share with their students, I'm not really sure why this issue is happening. Does anybody know how to solve this? I'm just going to take a quick 2 minutes to see if I can figure this out. And kind of modeling that for students, that making mistakes is part of learning. And, and so that brings us to the third piece, which was that it's okay to ask for help when you need it. Our student demographic is getting younger and younger in adult education. And so when COVID hit, I think many teachers expected for their students to have a certain familiarity with basic technology tools on the computer. And that wasn't the case. It really wasn't the case at all. So super important to have a technology orientation for all students, regardless of age, background, just to do a basic assessment to get a picture of where everybody is, what skills they have, and what they're going to need support with so that they can be successful learning using digital tools. Some of the main implications from this research are that there really needs to be space for some long-term technology strategy planning within centers, within boards. So obviously nobody was prepared for this kind of global event to happen. But when it happened, it did really show a lot of cracks that existed in the system to an incredible degree. So when the pandemic hit, for example, and students were learning online, they didn't have access, many of them didn't have access to devices, didn't have access to high-speed internet, didn't have, also in adult education, adult ed students weren't allowed to take the youth sector school buses anymore. So they couldn't even get to school if their school had adopted hybrid learning. So having some sort of strategy, devices on hand to be able to lend out to students, that took a little while to be able to organize. But even something as basic as in adult education, students didn't even have school board email addresses sometimes because our students is seen as transient. They can come and they can go. And so even just something as basic as creating an email address for them wasn't part of our regular practice. Tech training for teachers hasn't been a big focus. And so we have, gaps in tech skills among students, but also among teachers. And the pandemic really showed that technology isn't optional anymore. Everybody has to have a certain, degree of familiarity, a certain ease with technology. And then the very last thing is that online or hybrid learning was actually pretty helpful for a lot of our adult learners. It gave them more space to balance, their work, home, and family responsibilities and school at the same time. So although online and hybrid learning definitely wasn't for everyone, especially for many of our learners who have exceptionalities, who had a harder time, like managing their time during the pandemic or getting started on their work and really needed more support. It definitely was harder for some of those students, but for other students, it was like, now I maybe have a chance to be able to handle all the things on my plate. And so that's something that, that our centers have realized, that the government has realized as well. So those are going to be offerings that we are able to continue with in the future, which is excellent. We'll be able to meet, more student needs.